This adorable little quilt is, of course, embroidery. It's the little Peter Rabbit collection, and it's got white squares in the middle of a pieced block, and then it's got the green sashing. So the first thing I did was, of course, stabilize this by doing the outer border with my pumpkin seed and then stitching around the outside of each of these blocks. Some of them I've already completed, but I want to show you how I quilted those. I'm going to finish in this area where I have some sashing here that is not completed yet. And I'll show you how I did that so I could do it continuously. Using these blocks, you see there are definitely squares in the piecing. And I'm going to just visually use those blocks as my guide to do these half circles. So as I come down here like this, just jump down and then back to the seam. Jump down and back to the seam. Jump down, back to the seam, and back to the seam. Now when I get to this point, I can go up one of the sashings. So I can complete the vertical sashings as well as the horizontal at the same time, because I'll be going up and back down. So here we go. I'm going to go around to the seam, to the seam, to the seam, to the seam, and now from this point I'll just jump back in the other seam. So I'm using the piecework as my guide so that my design is spaced evenly. And that put me back to this point. Now this isn't exactly the same size as the square, but you know what? That doesn't matter. Nobody said that these all have to be exactly the same. So in these little corner set areas, the pumpkin seed will be a little smaller, but we will still jump down and back up to the seam. And then we'll continue across the sashing like that. You can see how fast you can get a sashing finished. Here's another little one to the seam, 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 to the seam. I just keep my eye on the seam, and then at this point I will be jumping back in the middle of those and go back the other direction across this simple pumpkin seed. And then we will have that sashing all completed. I am using constant because I'm comfortable with that, but you could certainly use regulated. And for beginners, regulated is a wonderful thing to start with, so you don't have to worry about stopping and starting and feel like you're in a rush. The first thing I'm going to do is stitch in a ditch around this middle square to secure it. And I am using the blue thread. Notice that I started over here on the side of the square, not in a corner. Do not start in a corner, an intersection. That's the worst place to start and stop with your stitch in the ditch. So there I go all the way around the square. Now I'm going to, this is actually a star template, but I'm using the circle. This is my circle star. And the circle is a 6-inch circle. And so I'm just going to move my machine out like that and make sure that this is, I can see through the template, make sure that that's even. Of course you could measure if you wanted to. But I'll just start it right out here like this. You can see my fingers. I keep my fingers right around where the template is. Keep the machine foot next to the template. As I come around, when I hit this opening, all I have to do is stop and just rotate that around so that doesn't make a little bobble. And then I can just move my hands around like that and then make sure that I meet up right there. So now I put a circle. How fast was that? I love using these templates because you can do perfect work and so quickly and fast without marking your quilt. and there's so many uses for them. Now I'm going to use my ruler and just do some very simple line work out in here. And I do want to start here, and this is an intersection, so I will start about 1/4 of an inch away from that intersection, and then take some tiny stitches to the intersection, like that. Then I am going to lay my ruler so that it's just 1/4 inch away from the edge of that circle. So I will be sewing a line to the edge of the circle, and then over to that intersection, and the other way. Just a straight line. So I'm making a square, virtually making a square around that circle. And you have to adjust it a little bit because, you know, nothing is perfect. This is fabric. None of it is set in wood. Just going to sew in this ditch again, right to that point. And then I will stitch in the ditch across this half square, or this triangle. Stitch in the ditch right there. Then come down to my seam here. And then back up to the intersection here. Stitch in the ditch across that line. Down to the intersections. You can see how simple it is. Very simple. This quilt, I used the Hobbs wool batting, and it is so soft. You will notice a difference with that Hobbs wool batting the minute you put it on. Not a lot of things I notice a difference with as you're actually quilting, but this is one. It's just like quilting and butter. It's just amazing. And that completed that over there. Now, in this 4-inch block in the middle, of course, I have my applique, and I want that applique to be raised up. So I am going to use my applique helper to stitch all around that applique, and just kind of go around the edges of it. And if there's a place that it goes in, I will go in. You've seen me probably stitch around embroidery before. Remember that your left hand is really in control of where you're going when you're using an applique helper. Your right hand is only helping to propel the machine. Very, very light touch. Now I'm going to remove the applique helper. That was very easy. And I want to do pattern meandering. I'm going to make sure that I'm perfectly perpendicular to the outside of this square, except in the corners, and I'll be fanning out around the corners. So I'll show you what I mean. See, I am perpendicular to the outside. And as I come around the corners, this sort of has to come a little larger and then smaller at the bottom. So, and then it gets back to very, very even again. So this just goes back and forth. We get back down here to the corner, and I'll be swinging out a little bit more and then tight, more and tight till I change direction. And now I'm back to vertical. This will really pop that applique, that embroidery right out. So out a little bit more and then in. Can you see how these are very tight in here, close to the embroidery, but then they swing out and get a little bit bigger out in the corner. And that allows you to fan out around the corner. And then when you get back onto the sides, you want this to be very even. I truly love what turned out here. It's very simple quilting. I like the circle with the lines. It's a good contrast. And then it really raised the embroidery up by just doing this simple pattern meandering around it. On the alternate yellow blocks, I am not going to stitch in the ditch around the square. I really am going to use this star template over this whole thing. I'm so excited about this because I don't use this big template very often, and I don't know why I haven't thought of this before. But to use this, I just come over here. I'm just going to get my machine in here. I'll make sure that I am not going to be stitching on the embroidery, and I'll start on the side, not in a corner, but on the side of one of the pieces of the star there. There we go. And then I will hold it. Remember that it takes a little bit of practice with these templates. And also make sure that you really have your quilt secured with your clamps, because the quilt cannot move with you when you are using these templates. And then I'll go right to there, and I'm going to just go back a little ways because I really want to get back into that yellow. Cut my thread there, and I can remove that template. That might be my new favorite template. And now I'm going to go into constant and increase my speed a little bit. I'm going to just do some little pinwheels all around here, and that's a really good contrast to the star. Makes it really fun, and also a good contrast to what I've done in the other squares. If you remember, we used the lines. And these are large pinwheels. These are, I'm not going to do tiny in here, but you could certainly do real tiny around there and really raise that star up. But I think with the batting that I've used, it's so supple that it will really raise up. Also, I have used a minky fabric for the backing, which I love to do on baby quilts. They didn't have minky when my babies were little. So I'm really having a fun time using that minky. And I want to show you how I'm going to bind it with just using the backing instead of a separate piece of binding. It's just a simple quilt. Certainly not a show quilt, but one that will be loved and used a lot. And look how fast that entire block got done with using that template. I had already stitched around the applique, so it's already raised. And then I can just go into a seam there and stop, and that's just popping out already. I did stitch around the applique using my applique helper before I started. And there's the star of that block. On this block that's in the center, my sister loved this fabric when it's all just a whole piece of fabric. And so I just divided it by stitching in the ditch in between the squares. They weren't pieced, they were just, that's the way the fabric was. It's a cheater cloth, what they call a cheater cloth. But I'll go ahead and I'll stitch around some of this print in the fabric so that it will almost look like an embroidery too. I'm just doing a little feather around the outside. Just keep quilting. And it's all going the same direction. I'm not changing direction or anything. It's just all going to be the same direction. I'll really make that block outstanding. I don't want to do too heavy quilting on this quilt, because I want to keep it really soft. And there we go. Just kind of outlining very carefully these little flowers. I'm going to put some ribbons inside. And then I'm going to come to the outside and I will feather this heart. And I kind of outline the outside of that as I'm feathering it. Get our strings out of the way, our thread. This is filling up the entire block with feathers. Just reaching out wherever I need to. There we go. And I may just come around and outline again just to define that heart a little better. All right. Well, I did a little more than I thought I was going to do, but I just couldn't leave it alone. I love feathers, and I think this is great. So you can leave it alone, or you can do a little more quilting, but either way, it's going to turn out great. I have left 2 inches of the minky as I trim this all the way around the quilt, and then I just cut, even with this edge and even with this edge, a wedge out of here. And then all I do is I fold this down once and twice, like that, we pin that, and then once and twice, and then this folds over into a miter. You just fold that into a miter as you're stitching it. And I stitch this miter too, so that it's completely stitched. And that makes a nice edge of minky for around that quilt.